Hello everyone. In this second part of the troll modeling video, I'm going to create the UVWs and textures for the character. Now, because the character is symmetrical, I can just go ahead and make half the character's mesh have UVWs and then just mirror that over to the other side. And so final adjustments here on the model before I move on. It doesn't mean that you can't do changes on the model afterwards. There's still a chance to do changes, but this is a good moment to double check everything before you want to export. Also, before you start animating, you want to double check your scale and your X form so that you make sure that all the transforms are baked into your character, or at least that all of the transforms are reset into your character. So the way that I do this is by pelting. So you create a seam on the model where you want your mesh to split and open. So imagine removing the skin off an animal that someone would hunt. Sorry for the horrible image, but it is kind of similar to that in a way. Even the name pelt is based on that. So you find places that you think are not going to be too visible, especially if you're doing like a quick dirty job like I'm doing here, because this is a model that is going to be super tiny on screen. I don't have to be really fussy about the seams on my texture. So what I do is I find places that I think have less visibility and then just use that as my cutting point for again opening up the mesh. The hands are a big problem because of the way they are. They will deform naturally, so I'm trying to use the preview here on the test texture to kind of see if the texture is going to deform too much, because that will make my life a little more difficult when I'm actually texturing and painting the texture for the model. For the feet here, I split them apart using a line through the back, and as well split the sole of the foot separately as well. And it wasn't working at first because I forgot that I also had the sole of the foot selected when I tried to pelt, and that's why it was sort of bending on itself, a little bit weird. Again, using the texture as reference. I'm also using the texture as reference for scale to make sure that all the different parts of the mesh, or the UVW clusters, all the different parts are scaling kind of similarly. The face is a little more problematic. One, it's easier for me to just deal with a mesh that looks close to the face because it's easier for me to paint. Second, it is a focal point regardless of whether or not I make it contrasting or I make it big or small. People are drawn to looking at faces of things, or characters or animals, because it is what we usually do in our everyday life. So I want to make sure that that reads well, and that when I draw it, I kind of hit the marks when placing my sketch lines and placing my shading as well. And also, as you see, there's automated tools in Max, which is what I'm using, to actually fill in the UVW space as well as possible. I mean, it's still some distance away to what some other softwares will do automatedly. I mean, there's some really black magic softwares out there doing this. But as long as I'm not super wasteful in the texture, then I'm good for having something that looks that has a bit more space in the texture. I just want to make sure that I use this as best as possible. And especially with humanoid characters, it is very difficult to get 100% or even 80% coverage of your UVW space. I mean, you want to make sure that you go over the 50% or more, but at least you don't want to have like big gaps and big differences in scale. So I'm using two actions here. One of the actions converts the image, the texture that I imported, into a Photoshop file that is ready to work. And the other one is a automated save, which hides the UVW's mesh reference, saves the file, and then shows them back up again. And that saves the PSD file, which 3ds Max can open, so it's fine. And you can just save a file, come into 3ds Max, and it will show you what the texture is. So here I was just looking at the old texture. I think at this point of the stream, this was a stream, of course. At this point in the stream, I was just explaining some of the stuff that I had done previously on a different model. So this is a model, we have the texture, and I'm going to paint some of the lines that I believe I can kind of guess just by looking at the mesh, again, because I remember where things were. And once I put that on the character, I can kind of see if I went a little too far off the marks or not. Also, more than once I will use, or more often than not, I will use 3ds Max's viewport canvas, which actually allows you to paint the texture inside of 3D Studio Max. I just don't really like to do that when, you know, Photoshop is so comfortable. So a lot of this is just me adding and again marking where the texture spots that I identified will actually be. And I've done this before. In some of these cases you can actually bake an ambient occlusion map right now for the character and get a really decent shading on going on the character. But I personally quite like the feeling of trying to guess or, you know, exploring where the light is. So here I'm going with the viewport canvas and I'm drawing very strong bold lines of where I think wrinkles, muscles, and skin folds will be. So that will be used as reference for me on playing with the file again as in Photoshop. So in this case I just import those sketches in and use them as reference. And now the tendency is to come in with very basic shading, like broad strokes shading, just going in and adding shadows where I think the shadows are going to be. I usually start with shadows. I don't like starting with a black texture or with a white texture because there's only one direction you can go, right? You can't lighten a white texture, you can't darken a black texture. So I usually start with a gray and then I play with first shadows and then light and kind of feel with go forward with what I think is what the model needs or the texture needs. So I had a little bit of trouble there just saving the file because of the viewport canvas a trick that I did. So right now I'm painting shadows and double checking on the model to see if I like anything that I see, and a lot of these are not only some of them are respect the mesh, of course, but it's such a low poly model that there's also a lot of room for me to actually sort of make up detail. One of the comments on the chat in the stream was that the characters are meant to be like stylized, but then the texture is kind of using a realistic approach in which I kind of play with light as realistically as I can, and I play with muscles as realistic as I can, and that kind of got me wondering whether or not I want to be more simplified in the approach. And I kind of went for a gradient coloring system later on, just to not have this look like a toy, make it look like it has a little bit more thought into it, even though, you know, a lot of this is just me having fun painting. I mean, there's in no way to kind of take that away from the experience. Once you kind of feel comfortable with the shading, once you feel comfortable with what you have on your model, it kind of becomes a pleasurable job to do all these details and seeing sort of the character take shape and come to life in a way. So the whole point here of the model is in a way to be the bearing of taking the texture on top and just sort of acting as the canvas for the texture. It's a 3D canvas in a way. Also, a lot of the time I'm looking at the model, I'm thinking that there's low contrast on the texture, and that's fine because I really don't want to push anything. I can always increase the contrast with a couple of clicks on the menus, right? So it's not like I have to be using black and white to shade my model in high contrast. That doesn't really need to happen. What I do need is to sort of make sure that everything hits the contrast levels correctly. So if the shadows on the skin are going to be darker than the shadows, for example, on the tusks or on the shorts, I need to make sure that contrast reads. A lot of times I'll do something like that. I'll take a selection and just drop in a soft brush pass just to create the sense of gradient, almost like there's a highlight on the top. And because I've already gone into the bright shades, I'm already adding details and sort of bumps on the model that will help increase contrast. So especially on the belly there, you can see that highlight right there. Oh, I was explaining something that I did on Krita. This was just me talking about the palette knife on Critter, which is really cool because you can kind of paint a color and then just go in and smudge that color in. So that was just a really weird sidetrack. But yeah, I do like when people in chat start really asking questions and sort of become interested in the process, and that's why I guess that's why I do the videos as well. And adding the highlights changes your perception of the model, because what previously was a model that was just tones of gray, now it's like this the sensation of, is my model really that bright, or am I just completely missing the contrasts, right? So it's not unusual to go in and take this layer, for example, duplicate it, and use that same layer as an overlay pass to make the shadows a little darker and the brights a little brighter. And the idea for that is just to add contrast. Now, contrast is great in big things, especially if you play with the amount of contrast to lead the viewer's eye. If you want to make a player look at a character's eyes or face more than the rest of the body, you can kind of lower the contrast on the rest of the body. It's actually something that Valve did with Team Fortress Design. They actually reduced both the contrast and the saturation of the color as the texture moved towards the legs, for example. They wanted to focus more of the player's attention on the torso and face areas, because those are the ones that actually distinguish the characters' classes from each other. So unless you want to, play around with that, contrast can be really interesting. The problem is that this is a very small character on the screen. Adding a lot of contrast on that character will actually make him noisy. So in this case, I'm using a new layer on top in color mode, and I'm adding a teal color, which I'm going to use as a base for my blue for the troll. And then I gradually add small amounts of gradient from the tops of that part. And right now it just looks like a gray guy on a sleeveless shirt. But as soon as I paint in the arms, now it looks like he's using like a wetsuit, because the face and hands have not been painted. And that's kind of what you want to do. You want to sell, like right now it's just a guy with a gray head, but once I paint the head, now it's just a green guy with gray shorts, and that's basically it. And I can play along with, well, he's a little older because the ears are white. I also can play around with the hue and saturation on this layer specifically, because that will allow me to kind of create variations of skin colors which I want. I think the highlight on the belly now just became a little too bright. I'm going to change that a little bit. And again, I forgot to paint the ears. I don't know why I'm not doing that. Actually, it's quite annoying me right now. I don't like my own process, it would seem. This is another thing that I usually do, is just copy a little bit of a layer, paste it to a new layer, and set the color, the layer blending mode to the same, so in this case to color, to make sure that I match the color from that specific area of the texture to a different part of texture, which is going to land on a similar part of the model. So I took the color for the ears from the side of the head so that I can match it a lot more closely. You saw me there just previously just adding contrast to the highlights of the arms and stuff, and that, I thought it looked nice, but I think it looks off-brand in a way because of the way that I do the character. So I wanted to have a belt. People suggested actually have just one strap go across the torso. That's already something that we use on one of the characters, so I don't want to mix that in. So I added this rope, like holding up his shorts, but then I remember that it has to have some fabric on top, so I just create a selection on the rope layer. I make like this sort of noisy selection, and actually then delete away. I think I actually use a mask and then delete away from that. So here's a selection, and using a mask, I just sort of carve away and cast a shadow from the cloth from the shorts onto the rope itself. The detail on these extremities, and especially on the foot, it's important to have the feet be bright because they will stand out as the character's walking. So it's not like there's a hierarchy of relevance for the body parts, but there is a hierarchy of visual relevance. So is that bit going to be moving, and do you want people to look at it? If so, you play around with the contrast, but especially with the silhouette and shape. It's very important to deal with silhouettes in games that feature multiple characters, right? So fighting games, for example, if you really pay attention, all of the characters have different stances, different idle animations, and obviously different silhouettes. So if they're playing in a level that is against the sunset, you should be able to tell your character from the other one just by looking at the silhouettes. And it's an important feature, and also puts the designer in this state of mind where he has to make things different, because every character and every person in a way is different, or has sort of different features. And you want to play with that to increase the readability of your game, especially in games that have a lot of characters on screen, like strategy games. You want to make sure that you read what the menace is. Once some character enters the screen, you want the player to be able to almost instantly tell what character that is and how does he represent a problem or a menace to the game. Details are the most laborious bit of the process, but also the most fun, I feel. It takes it takes a little bit to actually go in and do all these shapes and all these parts that are kind of interesting, but as well it makes it more fun, I think, to add all of this stuff, and it's interesting because when you get into it and you get into the habit of actually shading, it actually becomes fun. So this is close to the end of the modeling process, and someone in the chat suggested maybe to have blood on the tusks, which I think is cool, but it's rather violent for the type of game it is, so I sort of smudge it away. I kind of like the detail of red because that helps sort of stand them out a little bit. And here I just point them forward a little because they were pointing outwards a lot, and you really don't do anything with sideways tusks. And so this was the texturing process. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and next I'll be animating.